Welcome to a chilling journey into the unknown, where ordinary nights turn into unforgettable nightmares. Tonight, we're sharing 3 terrifying stories that reveal the hidden horrors lurking just beyond the shadows. Each tale is as eerie as the next, a midnight encounter that leaves one person questioning reality, mysterious phone calls that make privacy feel like a distant memory, and a New Year's Eve party visit that takes a dark, unexpected turn. So, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and prepare yourself, because these stories will haunt you long after they end. Are you ready to face the fear? Let's begin. The strange guest at the New Year's Eve party. It was New Year's Eve and everyone was excited. Jenna had invited her closest friends to her parents' old house on the edge of town, a place where she'd grown up. The house was spacious with a vintage charm, complete with creaky floors and dim lighting that made it look like it had its own secrets. Her friends always joked about the house looking haunted, but Jenna laughed it off. Tonight, though, was supposed to be different. It was the start of a new year and a fresh chapter. The party was in full swing. Music played softly in the background and laughter filled the air as people gathered around to share their New Year's resolution. Jenna's best friends, Mike, Sarah, and Derek, had shown up early to help her decorate, and the rest of the group arrived shortly after. There were about 15 people, all dressed up in their holiday best, ready to bid farewell to the past year. Around 11:30 p.m., just when everyone was settling into the living room to start the countdown to midnight, Jenna noticed a figure standing in the doorway. She didn't recognize this person, and at first she thought one of her friends had invited someone she didn't know, but something felt off about him. The stranger was tall, with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white movies, complete with a long, dark trench coat that seemed out of place. His hair was slicked back, and he wore a blank expression, almost as if he was out of touch with his surroundings. Jenna shivered, a strange chill running down her spine. She turned to Sarah and whispered, "Did you invite him?" Sarah shook her head, confused. "I thought he was your friend." Jenna felt uneasy. She scanned the room and noticed that everyone else was either too engrossed in their conversations or too tipsy to notice the strange man standing there. She decided to approach him. "Hey, welcome to the party," she said hesitantly, trying to sound friendly. "I'm Jenna. Who invited you?" The man simply stared at her, his eyes cold and unmoving. Jenna waited, but he didn't respond. After a moment, he nodded, a slow and eerie motion that made her feel like she was in a dream. She felt goosebumps rise on her arm. "Okay, enjoy yourself," she said, backing away slowly. As she returned to her friends, she whispered to Mike, "There's something weird about that guy." Mike shrugged, not overly concerned. "Probably someone's +1 who drank a bit too much. Just ignore him. Let's enjoy the night." Midnight was approaching and everyone gathered in the living room. Jenna noticed the stranger had now moved to the far corner, standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the group. It was as if he was studying them, watching every move. Jenna tried to ignore it, telling herself she was just imagining things. As the clock struck midnight, everyone cheered and clinked their glasses. The room filled with noise as people celebrated, hugging and wishing each other a happy new year. Amid the joy, Jenna turned to look for the stranger again, but this time, he was gone. She felt a pang of relief, thinking maybe he'd just left quietly. But then, as the laughter died down and the excitement settled, they heard a strange scraping sound coming from upstairs. The room fell silent. Jenna looked around, hoping someone else had noticed it too. "What was that?" Derek asked, his eyes wide. Everyone exchanged nervous glances. Jenna's heart raced as she replied, I don't know. Maybe the house is settling?" The scraping continued, louder this time, like nails dragging along the walls. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on everyone's faces. The laughter and cheer had faded, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. Mike tried to brush it off. "Come on, guys. It's probably just an old pipe or something." But Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She glanced up the staircase, and that's when she saw him. The stranger, standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't move, just stared with that empty, unsettling expression. Everyone followed her gaze and froze, their faces pale with fear. Without warning, the stranger began to descend the stairs slowly, each step echoing through the silent house. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical. Jenna's mind raced as she tried to understand who or what he was. She'd seen everyone who entered her house, and she was sure she hadn't let him in. "Who are you?" Jenna managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stopped halfway down the stairs and tilted his head to the side as if considering her question. Finally, in a low, gravelly voice that sent shivers down everyone's spines, he said, "I'm here to celebrate the end of things." No one dared to move. His words hung in the air, chilling them to their cores. Jenna felt a cold dread wash over her. She didn't understand what he meant, but she knew it wasn't good. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting faint shadows through the windows. Panic set in as everyone fumbled for their phones, desperate for some source of light. When the lights flickered back on, the stranger was gone, as if he'd never been there. But something was different. The room felt colder, the air heavier. Jenna's friends looked around, confused and frightened. "Did that just happen?" Sarah whispered, clutching Jenna's arm. Jenna nodded, her hands trembling. "Yes, but I don't know what he meant by the end of things." As the guests hastily gathered their belongings, eager to leave, Jenna noticed a small slip of paper on the floor where the stranger had stood. She picked it up, her heart pounding. It was a handwritten note with only 2 words, "See you." Jenna's mind raced, but before she could react, the lights flickered again. This time, a shadow moved past the window outside, then disappeared into the night. No one spoke as they filed out of the house, too shaken to even say goodbye. Jenna locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm her racing heart. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's words were more than just a haunting memory. As she walked upstairs, she felt that the night wasn't over, that something or someone was still watching. And in the quiet darkness of her room, as she tried to sleep, she swore she heard footsteps in the hallway, echoing softly, promising that this New Year's Eve would be one she'd never forget. Title: The Midnight Encounter on Ridgeway Road. It was New Year's Eve, and Tom, Amanda, and their friends, Josh and Liz, were returning from a party. The 4 of them had been friends since college, and each year they made it a tradition to celebrate together. That night they had decided to take a scenic route home, a quiet, winding road known as Ridgeway Road that cut through miles of forest. It was a dark, narrow lane with only sparse streetlights, creating an eerie tunnel through the trees. The road had a bit of a reputation. Locals whispered about strange occurrences and even claimed it was haunted. Some said that late at night, strange figures appeared on the road. But Tom laughed off the stories. He was skeptical of anything supernatural, and he enjoyed mocking the superstitions of the town. "Just a bunch of ghost stories," Tom had said as they left the party, a little tipsy but in high spirits. His friends laughed, joining in, but Liz seemed uneasy. She'd grown up hearing the legends and wasn't as quick to dismiss them. They were about halfway down Ridgeway Road when the temperature in the car seemed to drop, even though the heater was on. Amanda, who was sitting in the back seat, hugged her coat tighter around her. "Is it just me, or is it freezing in here?" she asked, glancing at the others. Josh, sitting next to her, shrugged. "It's winter. What did you expect?" Tom chuckled from the driver's seat. "Maybe the ghosts are giving us a chill," he joked, glancing at Liz with a mischievous grin. Liz tried to laugh, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced out of the window, staring into the dense forest, half expecting to see something lurking among the trees. As they rounded a curve, something flashed in front of them. Tom slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a stop. They all gasped, hearts racing as they tried to understand what had just happened. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, a woman dressed in a thin, white gown that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Her hair was long and tangled, covering her face, and her bare feet stood firmly on the icy road. She was motionless, blocking their path. For a moment, they all just stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Who is that?" Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he forced a laugh. "Probably some drunk from another party. I'll just go around her." He inched the car forward, but as he did, the woman lifted her head slightly, just enough for them to catch a glimpse of her eyes. Dark, empty pits that seemed to absorb all light. Everyone gasped. and Tom immediately hit the brakes again, fear clutching his chest. "Tom," Liz said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't go any closer." The woman took a slow, deliberate step toward the car. Her movements were unnatural, almost jerky, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. A sense of dread filled the car as they watched her, too terrified to move. Josh fumbled with his phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Ridgeway Road was known for its dead zones, and they were trapped with no way to reach anyone. The woman took another step, then another, until she was close enough that they could see her pale skin and the dark veins running up her arms. "Go! Drive!" Amanda cried, her voice breaking with fear. Tom didn't need any more convincing. He hit the gas and the car lurched forward, but just as they thought they would pass her, the woman vanished as if she dissolved into thin air. The road was clear, and all they could see was the empty stretch ahead. Did we all see that?" Josh asked, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," Liz whispered, clutching her seat. "I think we did." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the low hum of the engine. Just as they began to think they were safe, Amanda let out a blood-curdling scream. "She's behind us!" she cried, pointing at the rearview mirror. Tom glanced up and his blood ran cold. The woman was indeed there, her face inches from the back window, staring in at them with those empty, hollow eyes. She floated behind the car, her movements unnatural, as if she were being dragged along by an unseen force. Tom pressed the pedal to the floor, but no matter how fast they went, the woman stayed right behind them, her face never leaving the window. She began to mouth something, words that they couldn't hear but that seemed to vibrate inside their heads. "Stop the car!" Liz shouted, desperate. "Maybe she'll leave us alone if we stop." But Tom couldn't bring himself to do it. Fear had overtaken him completely. He gritted his teeth and sped on, hoping that somehow they would reach the main road and escape her. The woman's mouth opened wider, stretching into an unnatural, horrid grin that seemed to defy the limits of her face. Her eyes darkened, turning blacker than the night around them. Liz started to cry, her voice breaking as she clutched Amanda's hand. Suddenly, with a loud pop, the car lurched and swerved as one of the tires blew out. Tom struggled to keep control, but the car spun and skidded off the road, coming to a stop just inches from a large tree. Silence fell over them as they sat there, dazed and shaken. When they finally dared to look up, the woman was gone. Ridgeway Road lay empty before them, silent and still. We need to get out of here," Josh whispered, his voice shaky. They managed to get out of the car, huddling together, as they tried to assess the damage. The tire was flat, and there was no way they'd be able to drive without a spare. "Maybe we can walk to the nearest house," Amanda suggested, though the idea of walking down Ridgeway Road in the dark terrified her. They gathered their courage and began to walk, staying close together as they moved down the road. The night was eerily quiet. The only sound, their footsteps crunching on the icy pavement. But as they walked, they heard it. A faint, dragging sound coming from behind them. They turned, and there she was, standing in the middle of the road, watching them. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with that haunting grin, her dark eyes following their every move. They broke into a run, their breaths coming in gasps as they sprinted down the road. But no matter how fast they ran, they could still hear the sound, the slow, steady scrape of footsteps trailing them. Finally, they saw a glimmer of light ahead, the main road. With a burst of energy, they pushed forward, running as fast as they could. As they reached the light, they dared to look back one last time. The woman stood at the edge of Ridgeway Road, her figure fading into the darkness. She watched them with that hollow gaze, and for a moment, they thought they saw her lips move, forming words they couldn't hear. They didn't stop running until they reached the nearest gas station. Shaking and out of breath, they collapsed inside, too terrified to speak. The locals glanced at them, their faces a mixture of sympathy and fear. One old man approached them, his eyes somber. "Ridgeway Road, wasn't it?" They nodded, still trembling. He sighed. "You're not the first ones to see her. That's the Ridgeway ghost. They say she appears to those who are trying to leave something behind and follows them until they realize they can't outrun it." The four friends exchanged uneasy glances, their hearts heavy with dread. They had escaped the road that night, but none of them could shake the feeling that she hadn't truly let them go. As they left the gas station and returned to town, they felt the weight of her stare still lingering, as if somewhere in the shadows of Ridgeway Road, she was still watching and waiting for them to come back. The creepy phone calls and messages. It was late, and Sarah was just about ready to call it a night. She'd spent the evening binge-watching her favorite horror movies alone at home. She lived in a small town in Pennsylvania where things usually stayed quiet. But tonight, something felt different. An eerie silence hung in the air, and the only light in her house was the dim glow of her living room lamp. It started around midnight when her phone buzzed. At first, Sarah thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just a friend or some late-night notification. But when she picked up her phone, there was no name on the screen, just an unknown number. The message read, "I'm watching you." Her heart skipped a beat. She felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she laughed it off. This had to be a prank, probably one of her friends messing with her because they knew she loved horror movies. She typed back a quick message. "Very funny. Who is this?" She waited, but there was no reply. Thinking it was probably just a random text, she shrugged it off and went back to her movie. But not even 5 minutes later, her phone buzzed again. This time it said, "Don't bother locking the doors. I'm already inside." Sarah's hands shook as she read the message. She looked around the room, feeling an uncomfortable sensation that someone might actually be watching her. But she told herself it was just her imagination. After all, her doors were locked. She'd checked them before settling down for the night. She decided to ignore the message, thinking that maybe if she didn't respond, whoever it was would get bored and stop. But then, her phone rang. The same unknown number. She stared at it, heart pounding, debating whether to pick up. After a few seconds, curiosity got the better of her, and she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was silence on the other end. Just as she was about to hang up, she heard breathing, slow, deliberate breaths, as if someone was listening to her, enjoying her fear. Her skin crawled. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. After a long pause, a distorted voice came through. "Sarah, why don't you check your front door?" Her heart pounded. How did this person know her name? She froze, her mind racing. The logical part of her brain told her not to look, but she couldn't resist. Slowly, she got up and crept toward the front door, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked through the peephole but saw nothing. She sighed in relief, thinking maybe this was all just a bad joke. But as she turned away, her phone buzzed again. The new message said, "I see you, Sarah." She felt her blood run cold. Her hands shook as she typed back, "This isn't funny. Leave me alone." The response came instantly. "You can't ignore me." She backed away from the door, feeling the walls close in around her. Every shadow in her house suddenly seemed menacing, and every sound made her jump. She felt trapped, like there was nowhere to hide. Her phone rang again, and this time she was too afraid to pick up. She let it ring, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But then another message appeared. "Nice pajamas, Sarah." She looked down at her outfit. An oversized t-shirt and pajama shorts. How could they know what she was wearing? She closed all her curtains, desperately trying to block out any view from outside. Panic set in as she realized this person was somehow watching her. In a desperate attempt for answers, she called her best friend Megan. Megan picked up on the second ring, groggy but concerned. "Megan, someone's watching me," Sarah whispered, trying to keep her voice low. "What? Sarah, are you sure?" Megan asked, sounding more awake now. Sarah explained everything. The messages, the phone calls, the voice. Megan tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just some sick prank and that she should call the police. But before she could reply, another message came through. "Calling your friend won't help you." Her heart sank. "Megan, I think they're watching us right now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lock all your doors and windows," Megan said urgently. "I'm coming over right now. Don't answer the door for anyone." Sarah hung up and double-checked every lock, her heart racing. She sat in the corner of her living room, hugging her knees, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, waiting for Megan. 10 agonizing minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Her phone buzzed again. "Let me in." She froze, her body paralyzed with fear. She knew Megan wouldn't knock. She'd just come in, knowing how scared Sarah was. Slowly, she inched toward the door and checked the peephole. It was Megan, looking impatient. Relief flooded through her, and she opened the door, pulling her friend inside quickly. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, locking the door behind her. Megan looked around, clearly unsettled by how shaken Sarah was. "Did you call the police?" Sarah nodded. "They're on their way. I just don't understand how they knew everything. They knew my name, what I was wearing, even that I called you." Megan tried to reassure her, but she looked worried too. They sat together waiting for the police, neither of them daring to look at their phones. Then, just as they thought the worst was over, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but something compelled her to check. It was another message. This time it read, "Two can play at this game." Suddenly, Megan's phone buzzed. She checked it, and her face went pale. She turned to Sarah, eyes wide with terror, and showed her the screen. The message said, "You shouldn't have come here, Megan." Both girls stared at each other, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. They couldn't understand how this person was watching them so closely, even knowing Megan's name now. The tension in the room was unbearable as they waited in silence, hoping for the police to arrive soon. Then, out of nowhere, the lights in the house flickered. The air grew thick, and they both heard a faint, distorted whisper coming from Sarah's phone. They didn't wait. Grabbing their coats, they bolted out of the house, running into the street, hearts pounding as they fled from the unseen terror that seemed to follow them. When the police finally arrived, they searched Sarah's house, but found no signs of forced entry or any indication of a stalker. They dismissed the messages as a prank, telling the girls to block the number and get some rest. But later that night, as Sarah lay in bed, her phone buzzed again. With a shaking hand, she opened the message. It said, "You can run, but you can't hide." And just as she read it, she heard that slow, deliberate breathing coming from somewhere in her room. The last thing she saw was her screen fading to black as her phone shut off on its own, leaving her alone in the dark. The haunting calls and messages never stopped. Sarah and Megan were left wondering if they'd ever truly be safe again. And somewhere in the shadows, their unseen tormentor waited, watching, always watching.